here, but excellent. Thank you, Jane. Good. Secretary Clauser, would you like to walk through the agenda? Or would you like me to?
You can go ahead, David.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is what we're hoping to do in the time we have today. I'll just pull this up. This is online as usual, and Jane had thrown in the chat the link. In addition to approving minutes, as we usually do, we wanted to spend just a very small amount of time to let, if any of you have some input or feedback on the obligatory report that ANR has to send over to the legislature about the GWSA implementation. This is an opportunity to provide that feedback. We'll do that. And then the bulk of our time we want to spend on work planning for this year. And there's a hyperlink here in the agenda that I think goes to some slides. Yeah, it goes to the slides that we'll be using to walk through today. And on the basis of that, we'll also talk a little bit about what we think, how we want to structure the agenda on the 24th for the full council. That's what we've got lined up for today in the hour we have. So it's really those two pieces. As always, we'll have some public comment at the end if any members of the public are here with us that want to weigh in. But those are the two big pieces, just about 10 minutes on this report, and then the bulk of our time walking through some big questions around the work plan for this year. And what's hyperlinked in the agenda is really some initial thoughts. It was to get the conversation going. It's not to say this is the plan. Any questions about the agenda and what we're trying to do today? All good? Okay, great. Let's do it. First thing we like to do here is the minutes from our meeting on the 22nd. I'll let everybody click in through there if they want to remind themselves of those minutes. I'll give folks just a second to do that. I'll drop my share. Okay. Any comments on the minutes, or anyone need a little more time to scan those? Okay, great. Let's consider those minutes approved. Thanks, everybody. So the first thing we wanted to do substantively is open up the a space for feedback on this report. This was sent around in the meeting materials, I think on Friday or maybe Thursday. I can't remember, Jane. And Jane, do you want to just give a little bit of context to this? Not a ton, but just a tiny bit of context. And I see Jared's hand. But just a little bit of context.
I'm happy to wait for Jane's context.
Okay, great. Jane, go ahead, please.
Sure. So this report is required by the GWSA to be presented by the council to the General Assembly by January 15th. So on your behalf, I worked to prepare the draft that has been included and circulated with all of you. Thought today that we could hear from you on your general feedback to date, and then provide a clear path for any final written revisions that you all would like to provide to me before this is sent out. My expectation, though, is that on behalf of the council, the steering committee would approve this report, and I do not foresee sharing it with the full council, recognizing and appreciating the timeline that we're under to get this done. So I dropped in the chat the link to the report. It's not overly long, but if you haven't had a chance to review it yet, of course, we can also provide an adequate timeline to do that between now and submitting it to the legislature.
Great, super. Jared, go ahead, please.
Thanks, David, and thank you, Jane, for this draft. Overall, I think it looks pretty good. I do have one kind of significant concern after reading it. I just, on the minor side, I noticed a couple of small copy edits that I can send over if that's helpful. But the substantive concern I have, let me find the page and paragraph, is the last page, the second to last paragraph. Here, I can just share this if that's helpful, so everybody can see it, or unless you want to, Jane, if you already have it up.
I have it up if you want me to share
David,
it.
sure. Yeah, the last page, the second to last paragraph, that first sentence that reads, the VCC through the CAP has made clear that voluntary incentive-based programs are the preferred method of transforming the thermal and transportation sectors. I think that the way that that's as broadly phrased as it is, it's inaccurate. I think that it's true that we prefer, and the recommendations list voluntary actions for Vermonters and for consumers. But on the thermal side, we explicitly included primary recommendations that are requirements on fuel suppliers, the clean heat standard, that would be requirements on fuel suppliers in the transportation sector, not voluntary, the Transportation and Climate Initiative program. On the fuel side, a vehicle efficiency price adjustment on the vehicles, or on the kind of side of manufacturers, which is mentioned in the next, and then the Advanced Clean Cars 2, which is a requirement on manufacturers that is mentioned. I just think that if the intent here is to signal that these are programs that are not putting requirements on individual Vermonters, I think that that's fine and that should be made clear. But I think it has been demonstrated in every state in the country across the world that we cannot and will not meet our emissions reduction requirement targets without binding requirements that are placed on manufacturers and fuel suppliers, which were many of the primary recommendations in the CAP, from the Clean Heat Standard to the Transportation and Climate Initiative program to the Vehicle Efficiency Price Adjustment, and there are others. So I'm just uncomfortable with how broadly that sentence is framed, and think as such it's inaccurate and problematic. I can suggest alternate language, but I just wanted to flag that as my primary concern.
Great, thanks. Jane?
Yeah, so I can share with you that the intent of this is, I worked with Ed McNamara, our new general counsel, on these last few paragraphs, and the intent is to signal and start to appreciate that the Agency of Natural Resources is on the hook for meeting these emissions reductions and the legal mechanism of which to do so. And so, you know, the CAP could have put forward a lot of rules and regulations, and we only have very limited ones in our sphere of control. So it would start to signal that the sort of nexus of where ANR has influence and control and where we don't. And so I think you're right that we can certainly represent that better in the first sentence, and don't mean to make it as straightforward perhaps as it reads right now around the limits and restrictions of other requirements through legislative processes and others.
Okay. All right. So maybe Jared, you could throw some suggested text out there to help get at the points you're trying to make. Okay, great, super. I'll just stop sharing for a second. Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, at the risk of maybe being redundant in the report, I would recommend adding to the second bullet in the very introduction piece, the beginning, establishing the Vermont Climate Council, maybe with a comma, responsible for the development of a comprehensive climate action plan. I know that that's detailed further in the responsibility section below, but if we're looking at the core elements of the act and acknowledging the requirements of the emissions reductions, I just also want to say that the role of the Vermont Climate Council is the mechanism to create the climate action plan, which is, I would consider that to be a core element.
Thanks. Okay. Excellent. Any other reactions, feedback, improvements to this report to the legislature? Anything else? Okay, great. Jane, were you looking for anything else in particular before we round this up?
I guess, barring Chris's any comment from Chris, my question to all of you is, have you felt like you've had enough time with it, and can we move that the steering committee approves what those suggestions by Lauren and Jared, that we have a final report to deliver to the General Assembly, or would you like some period of time, albeit maybe 2 days, I would say, to provide any further written comments or want to see a further draft?
Yeah, good question. Chris, and then let's answer that question.
I'm fine with the approach that was just suggested with, I don't necessarily need to see it again. I think with the edits that have been proposed, that'd be great. I guess I was wondering, does the steering committee have the authority to forward this on the council's behalf without the council weighing in?
Last year, Secretary Moore wrote it on behalf of the council, and I'd ask all of you is how I did not see any substantive process for adoption by the council last year. So it feels in line with what was followed a year ago.
Well, last year, actually, we made sure it came to the council because it was going to go without the council's review and approval at all. And so we stopped that and asked the secretary to please bring the draft to the council. As I recalling everybody.
Okay. Liz?
I'd love to, Liz, yeah.
Is it due the 15th? Is that the legislative deadline? Yeah. First of all, I think it looks good overall. And, the primary body of work is the plan that was recently adopted. So that's obviously noted here and said right up front, which is great. I think the last page I am just reviewing it, so I'll apologize for that and answering David's question. It probably is smart that we all make sure we have reviewed it. I think that last page actually presents a couple different potential pitfalls or landmines or whatever analogy you want to use. So reluctantly, I would suggest that we take a little bit of time to make sure that last page, if we're going to leave it in, is edited. And it's the part that Jared mentioned, but even the framing of it overall, I think the last page is meant to, especially knowing that you've looked at it with your general counsel, to sort of be the call out for A&R. And if that's what it's going to be, then I think we could both make that a little shorter and tighter, as well as consider that very last paragraph, which channeling other council members, I think might raise some concern. So I don't know what to do about that. One thing we could do is to not have it in there at all. In other words, make this much more of a process-oriented annual report and leave the cap to speak for the cap. Like, I'm not exactly sure that given that we put the climate action plan in place, you really need all of the last page. So anyway, happy to take any process that is suggested, including passing on line edits to Jane. But it feels like if we're going to leave that last page in, it might be viewed as substantive in tone enough by some that it's going to take review. And I therefore would agree with Chris that we might need to consider having the entire council review it, which I know is a timing issue because it's the 15th, which leads me back to the conclusion that maybe we could somehow drop it.
Okay.
I
Yeah,
appreciate that, Liz, and would support just dropping that last page too.
Yeah, I see a majority of you on the call right now supporting that view of dropping the last page. I'm not sure, to Chris's question, if there's a hard and fast, like, does the council need to see this or not? I think it's more a question of you all on the steering committee making a judgment call and giving also the circumstances of what this is, what it isn't, and what the timing is. So I leave it to you all to make that decision.
Well, I mean,
Chris,
I'll
is
just
that
know that,
again?
I mean, tonight we had to call a special meeting of the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel because our annual report is also due. We were not able to get that done at our December meeting, so we're having a special meeting tonight to get that done. That's being reviewed by the whole panel. I'm not trying to drag this out. I also don't know that, I know that this is due on a certain date. I also don't know that there's any annual report police that are going to be coming and getting us for delaying and putting this on the full climate council agenda that's regularly scheduled meeting, if we just let the legislature know what's going on. I'd personally feel more comfortable having the whole council review it at its next meeting, and just let the legislature know. And as a counselor, I'm happy, to I don't think anybody's going to come after us. They've got the plan. But a lot of what the report says is we developed a plan. So I think it'd be okay, but that's what I would suggest.
Okay. Jared?
Yeah, I wonder if, especially if I think that last page is probably the one that would lead to the greatest kind of debate or discomfort. And so if that is taken out, my suggestion would be, and then the report is basically a summary of what of the cap and what we already know and have agreed to. Could that kind of draft be shared with the full council in the next couple of days with the note from Jane? I'm just thinking out loud here, Jane, looking for your response, that basically says, this is the plan that we have developed on behalf of the councils to submit to the legislature, and that we will submit by, by Friday, close of business, unless we hear a concern from a councilor that this should not go forward. And if there is something raised, then I think we could call a meeting of the council. But if it really is just a straightforward summary of the cap and doesn't include some of the more substantive concerns that end up on that last page, which A&R could address separately in terms of their own legal analysis, then it would strike me that it would hopefully be fairly non-controversial and formulaic.
Okay. All right. So what I've heard is a majority of you interested in taking that final page out. Secondly, there's two options in front of us that I've heard. One is let the legislature know this will be a little late, put it on our January meeting for the council and let the council do it. Or Jared's suggestion right now is send it out to the full council by email and say this will go out unless folks have a concern about it, and therefore we'll put it on your agenda.
Then go to plan A. Yeah.
Chris, do you have a feeling about those two options?
I'm not sure we can do that. That's basically asking them to make a decision by email. We can't make decisions by email on a substantive matter about whether or not to submit a report. We can talk about, at least that's my interpretation of it. We can talk about whether or not we're available to meet or something like that. But in this case, we're saying, here's this annual report being submitted on behalf of the council. What say you? But that, to my mind, that should be a council matter, that we need to discuss, actually. Not trying to be a pain in the ass, but open meeting law and public engagement is sometimes a pain in the butt. So I'm just not sure the steering committee has the authority to make this decision on behalf of the council as a whole. I'm happy to be told I'm wrong. I'm asking the question. I'm just not sure that, or somebody to verify. Because I don't know the answer to that. Are we allowed to make this decision?
I don't know either. And I think either way, it should be shared with the council. I just don't know the path forward around a decision. Good points, Chris.
Okay. So I guess part of it is, go ahead, Jane. Go ahead.
Well, two points. First, on the point at the last page, the steering committee can vote to remove it, but I'll just suggest that I was just texting with Julie because Julie was very interested in having that section be in, and I'll just say that it's largely around the component that A&R is the backstop for the GWSA requirements, and for better or worse, that's the way the law is written. And so she's just proposing that we consider rewriting that to meet make everybody feel comfortable with how that's drafted, but recognizing and appreciation that the sort of buck stops with A&R, and that we need to put forward that clearer sooner, to appreciate that there aren't a lot of jurisdictional authority right now for rulemaking in the cap, but yet ultimately A&R will be on the hook, and we're trying to set the stage for that. So I think we could draft that more clearly, that in a place that makes you all comfortable, but if not, we can work on that as well. So that's one piece I'll just say. And then secondly, I'm happy to follow up with our general counsel for his opinion on whether or not we can merely share it with the council and ask for them to pull it for the full meeting discussion, or whether we have to just wait for the council to vote on it in a public meeting.
Okay.
Not vote, reach consensus.
Yeah. Okay. Lauren?
Jane, I wonder if, given that first paragraph of the 3 is sufficient to meet Julie's concern, just the acknowledgement, next steps will include not only those outlined on the previous page, but also the fact that A&R has the authority to start implement rulemaking. It's those last 2 paragraphs that I think might appear more subjective and be more cause for debate. So I wonder, not that you're speaking for Julie, but as insofar as you're texting her now, if you think that's that would capture her concern and wanting that covered.
Okay. Kristen, go ahead, please.
Sure. I appreciate that suggestion, Lauren. I don't think it would capture her entire concern. I think certainly the first and maybe a clarification of the second. Not wanting to speak for her, but speaking for her, I think that the first and a clarification of the second, it would probably be what she suggests, just because A&R's role here is pretty unique. So I just wanted to offer that, you know, given we're potentially discussing kind of a tweak or rewrite, and there's some other things, and the 15th deadline, that we could make those edits and put it on the agenda for our next meeting is what, the 29th?
Yeah.
And then you know, we can issue to the legislature a report indicating that the report is coming after a full vote on the 29th.
Perfect. Okay. I see some thumbs up from Chris and others on that. Yeah.
The next meeting is on the 24th, correct?
It's yes, Monday the
29th.
But the concept is sound, I think.
Even better, it's less than 10 days out.
Right. Right. Okay. Good. Yes. Okay. So it seems like we're circling in on something, which is why doesn't how about Julie and Jared at least do a quick check in to see how the final page might be reworked, and others are welcome to provide some thoughts and input on that. I will note that a majority of you were very happy taking that away, that final page. And so I think there's a high bar for getting something in there. But let's give it a whirl and to see if there's something that feels comfortable. And I see in the chat, Liz offers to be helpful, and or has been offered to be helpful. And we'll put it on the agenda for our next council meeting, and a note can go to the legislature on the 15th saying it's coming. Here's the cap, by the way, you already got it. Okay.
And maybe this is obvious, but just to put a finer point on it, that Lauren's suggestion, which seemed pretty straightforward, will be incorporated into a next draft. Okay.
Yes. Great. Yes. The one at the first the bullet at the top. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Does that seem good, folks? All right. Great. Okay. So why don't we push forward into the next piece of what we wanted to do today, which is to look at this our work plan. for this year. And as I mentioned, we put some ideas together just to kickstart this conversation. And they're hyperlinked in the agenda, and I'll share my screen now with them. And Jane and I will tag team this a little bit, and it comes out of a conversation with Jane and Marion, and also with Julie. So let me just share my screen with this. Okay, so when we thought about work plan, we thought about it in these kinds of buckets. The buckets of what are our areas of work, like what is it that the council needs to work on, and the subcommittees, and what are the areas of work. ANR has what its priorities are as an agency with statutory requirements under the GWSA. So what are those things that ANR is feeling are its priorities? And then how does the work actually get done between the council, the subcommittees, ANR, et cetera? And all this has a relationship with the legislature, which is sort of the center of activity of GWSA stuff in the coming months as it picks up the recommendations from the December 1 plan. Okay, so these are the buckets. We have a slide for each, and let's walk through them. In terms of areas of work, here's three buckets. One bucket is the substantive issues that continue to be on the table that need resolving, or at least work. The two that are clearest are transportation and biomass, because we have the TCI challenge and we left things on the table with biomass, so we thought we needed more work. There's also a set of sort of deciding on which technical work will get done and overseeing that to some degree. Here we have budgeted analysis and already completed, already budgeted analysis. And we need to be thinking about how we're finishing up that work. Also thinking about the future technical analysis and making sure that the council's giving clear signals to the legislature around budget and the like. And the final bucket is around engagement. This is something that the council and everyone has been very focused on. And so what does that look like? And that's a set of work streams for the council, subcommittees, and others. Okay, so those are the areas of work. In terms of ANR's priorities, within those and amongst those, this is what ANR's thinking, and Julie, Jane, and Marion can talk about why these are their priorities, but this is what ANR has been identifying as their priorities for 2022, and it has a heavy focus on the statutory requirements. And before I go to the next slide, Jane, is there anything else you want to say about this in terms of priorities for ANR?
I'll ask folks, would you like the 5-minute overview of like the status update on these things and requirements, or would you like to just know that these are the priorities right now for us and keep moving through? Not hearing any requests.
Okay.
Well, Jane, really quickly, the technical analyses, the technical work bullet, does that include those two the RFI and RFP from the Science and Data Subcommittee?
No, right now those are bucketed with respect to all of the other nice to haves want to do technical analyses, of which the list, I'll say, is growing. So at ANR, we have roughly, as you all saw and heard at the last steering committee meeting, and hopefully I saw Marion was gracious to send you, Lauren and Chris, the link so you could get up to speed on the budget components. We have roughly $400,000 left in our existing funds for technical analyses, beyond completing the pathways report, which is around the emissions reduction space. The statutory requirements that are remaining have us moving forward with the measuring progress tool, of which the framework has been proposed, but now the next step is moving into the development of that. And then the Municipal Vulnerability Index was not prepared for the Climate Action Plan. It's also statutorily required by the GWSA. So we plan to use our remaining budget funds towards those two things, appreciating that we don't even likely have enough money for both of those two things right now. And we have a request in around further support for a technical analysis budget that will have funding hopefully made available for fiscal year 23. But all of the other components, which include the RFP for agricultural emissions, the RFI, which would likely lead to an RFP for life cycle analysis, are outside of current funding that we have. So it doesn't preclude us from moving forward with the RFI, and we plan to do that because that doesn't cost us, it just gives us more information. But we'll have to wait and see what we get for a budget for technical analyses, and then would look to work with the council to prioritize those further additional analyses as put forward in the CAP and are evolving as we move into the work. Like the transportation space is going to need more analyses as to further inform policies. And that's just on top of the analyses already put forward in the Climate Action Plan.
Thanks.
And while
Jerry.
we're talking about contracts, I do just, since this is something I would have said, the update here around this is, I do just want to say that we have a contract with Climate Access, as you all know, and Rise Consulting for public engagement. We terminated that contract last week because of, and this warrants a larger conversation with all of you, but for a number of reasons. So that contract, they have 30 days until it's officially terminated. So there are components of those deliverables that they'll still be working on, but we'll be looking with conversations with Just Transitions and then the council more broadly to reformulate a public engagement strategy with all of you that works. And we don't, with the budget and funds that we had remaining in that contract, we intend and have the intent of using to support public engagement going forward, but Climate Access will no longer be working with us to support that.
Okay, thanks, Jane. Jared?
Yeah, if I can just go back a second to the question and maybe the previous slide, David, about the technical analysis. I fully understand and get and agree with Jane's distinction around things that have already been budgeted and that are the explicit statutory requirements. I would just say that, and it's not here, I think it just came out in the conversation and maybe it was just like a shorthand, but I would encourage us not to kind of think of or characterize the additional analysis as kind of a nice to have. Like the RFI on life cycle analysis, I think many of us on the Science and Data Subcommittee see that as necessary in terms of meeting the obligations of the GWSA and how we do tracking and in terms of what's laid out for emissions reduction. And I think that Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee would suggest similarly that, and the things that Jane just brought up in terms of further policy analysis, economic analysis, those to me are, while I understand they will be dependent on further allocations of funding from the legislature to enable us to do that, because the existing budget does not. I still think they're necessary. Whether they're funded or not is a different question, and I'm just very uncomfortable with that kind of nice to have framing.
Thanks, Jared. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so let's just yeah, and I think on the slide it's not framed as nice to have. It's framed as prioritize the additional technical analysis, that's required kind of thing. Okay. All right. So these are the things that ANR is for sure focusing on in 2022. And then let's talk just a tiny bit about how all this work might get done. And here, I think it's interesting to use the example of sort of what's been emerging already. And Jane's been pretty close to that and others here on this call to speak to it. And so I think maybe I'll let you all describe how that's been happening, but in essence, it's sort of cross group ad hoc, like cross subcommittee groups coming together, working on a specific issue, and then using the subcommittees then to vet this preliminary thinking or this, draft idea, and then bringing that up to the council once it's worked its way through subcommittee. So this has been happening. I wonder, Jane, or others who've been involved in sort of the transportation work, want to just say a word more about how this has been unfolding this year.
Yeah, so only the transportation work has really gotten underway, and Jared and Joey, Councilor Joey and Jared and myself are working on a memo that will get put forward to the smaller group to describe and outline a process that can be put forward and hopefully approved and vetted by the subcommittee to see through the further refinement of transportation policies to replace PCIP, and the role of that subcommittee in ultimately reaching consensus around ideas to bring up to the council. So it suggests not really dissimilar from how recommendations and ideas were put forward for the initial TAP, a process where technical experts and process people get together in a smaller group to actually flesh ideas out and then bring forward that work to subcommittees and as things progress on an on-needed basis to keep them informed to ultimately bring it up to the council. And so my understanding and appreciation is because that work is more discrete and not everything that we were developing for the climate action plan, there likely would be less of a need for the subcommittees to meet on such a regular basis, because those groups will need some time to actually see initiatives through and develop them. So our understanding and expectation is that subcommittees likely don't need to meet more than once a month. And then the question of how often council needs to meet based on what guidance and work the council is doing may need to meet monthly if you choose so, or we could actually foresee it going to more quarterly meetings to appreciate and bring work together only on an as needed basis.
Great. Okay. So that's an emerging idea. Yeah, go ahead, Jared.
I was just going to say this. I was just going to note that it strikes me as very similar to the kind of way of working, at least that I experienced in the science and data and cross-sector mitigation subcommittees, and I believe was taking place in other subcommittees, which is when there's a discrete task, identify a task group or a work group that can work to pull together information, frame up options, put together something for discussion before the full subcommittee. So this to me feels like really a continuation of the approach that was developed over the last year within the subcommittees and initially makes sense to me.
Right. Okay. Chris, go ahead, please.
This is a really specific subcommittee task, but I'm not sure. The Just Transition Subcommittee, I think we're going to have a conversation about what it is that the statute tasks us with. I don't have it all committed to memory, but basically it tasks the subcommittee with seeing through the Just Transitions principles and their execution and ensuring the plan has them in it, which is a mighty major group of responsibilities to assign to a subcommittee. So we need to talk about what that looks like going forward. But if that's going to be the case, I mean, I know the bandwidth of the folk on that subcommittee, including its chairs, have already said, we can't do a lot more. So I'm just throwing that out there that that subcommittee, I think, needs to kind of talk among itself, and then depending on how that goes, come back to the steering committee and or the council to say, here's what, and be a member of that subcommittee. I'll just say, here's what we think our role is, given what the statute says. I don't know that necessarily needs legal interpretation, but I just wanted to flag that for folk, because the way the statute reads, it's almost like that subcommittee is supposed to have an ongoing role for the life of the plan to make sure that that a just transition happens. I don't know that it could do that, but that's what the statute said.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah. Lauren?
I don't have a response to Chris, but generally support that general sentiment. A quick question on the ad hoc small groups, which, like Jared, I appreciate and I think will likely be an effective and organic format for advancing some of the initial proposals work. However, or not however, but looking at transportation work as the example that's given there, was that group kind of formed or acknowledged via the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee? And I guess I'm just asking that for transparency so that the general public knows what the process is for forming these smaller groups and who's going to be working on what. Yes,
Yeah,
It was. Mhm.
it was formed through cross-sector, although I will say that I do think that there are some task groups that will be more clearly cross subcommittee, like this biomass question on between ag and eco and science and data and cross-sector. Perhaps others, Just Transitions has brought it up. So I do think that it's a great point, Lauren, in terms of transparency, being able to see who is participating in those work groups, or know where, if there is an interest in, and provide updates at the council meetings of what work groups exist and the composition of them, so we're not missing a kind of subcommittee, especially on those cross issue ones.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Jared.
Okay, great. Okay, so those are like the components of a work plan that we were discussing. It sounds like what I'm hearing is, in principle, this feels right. I'm just going to scroll back to a few things. Hang on a second. If these feel like the right areas of work, and I'll take Jared's comment that let's be careful that prioritize additional technical analysis. We don't use language such as nice to have, but this feels like the right sort of buckets of work for the council and its related bodies. ANR's goals are emerging here, and then the coordination of the body of work, something along these lines, making sure we're being transparent about who's being involved and those launching from and going back to subcommittee meetings and council meetings. So this sounds like we're in the right zone here. Are there ways to make this stronger, better, adapt? I also take Chris's point, like Just Transitions may need to have a real conversation about its scope of work and the context of all this. I do know, for instance, though, Chris, a number of some volunteers from Just Transitions have agreed to, like, for instance, advance the ball as an ad hoc group on the engagement piece, and are moving that. So this process is kind of working as well with Just Transitions. I think it doesn't take away from the fact that what you're saying, Chris, is like we need to wrap our hands around what our responsibilities are in Just Transitions. Okay, but are there things to make this overall stronger, better?
I think this looks good. I might just suggest that we add a bullet that explicitly notes that at council meetings, at least when subcommittees are giving updates, we also update on what task groups exist and what they're working on, and have a way to share the composition of those task groups for anyone who's interested.
Right. Excellent. Okay. Okay. Anything else, Secretary Closer? You're on mute still.
How about now?
There you go. You're good.
Okay. So it probably doesn't need to be in the slide, but I think it would be helpful to reiterate, if we are meeting, if the full council is meeting quarterly, that documents be provided, especially, considering everyone's other commitments and expressions of, time and being burnt out, that any relevant documents or supporting materials, folks have, at least 2 weeks to review those prior to a full council meeting, especially if there's action requested as well. And I know things got really tight with the action plan and deadlines, but if we're meeting quarterly, it seems like we should be able to build that timeline in, but to set that expectation early, I think would be helpful.
Excellent. Yes. Okay. And on that same point, do people feel, this quarterly meeting idea of the council, unless more frequency is needed for specific time-sensitive issues, are others feeling like the council will likely start to shift towards a more quarterly approach? Does that feel right? Okay, hang on, sorry.
I'm just, while you're waiting, David, I'll just briefly react that I'm happy to follow the will of the group on this. I think if, I'd probably be a little bit more comfortable with every other month, but I think either way, it should just be kind of our guideposts and what we're planning for, but that the number and frequency of meetings may end up having to respond to kind of, be somewhat flexible based on the requirements of the legislation and requirements around revisions. I mean, we still will have some revisions due in June. And so I could imagine as that approaches, maybe there will need to be, a monthly meeting in April and May, for instance, if, to finalize the biomass recommendations or the transportation recommendations. So I'm okay to go with that for now as a starting point, but as long as we're leaving the door open to the possibility of initial meetings and just looking ahead, knowing that there will be cap revisions that need to be considered and either approved by consensus or voted on, by June is the timeline for some of those major outstanding pieces that we've either formed or will form ad hoc groups and then subcommittees will look at. I'd probably be more comfortable in saying, every other month rather than quarterly to start.
Yeah. Thanks, Jared. And one of the things I've sort of been talking about with Jane and others is let's lay out the timing of these things. Like you had mentioned biomass, you had mentioned the TCI thing, or things that have to be done by May, some rulemaking things, right, that are sensitive. So lay out that timing, and then you could put council meetings in appropriately to meet your deadlines. Okay. All right. Anything else to say on this, folks? What this does mean is for a proposed agenda for our 24th meeting, obviously we'll add in the report to the legislature that we talked about. We had talked for a just transitions reflection, be able to put out there what's going on around language accessibility. Language has been a big issue that's come up several times. So this is an opportunity to dig into that. We wanted to do two things besides that. One is have a conversation about how things went. This was a request that came out of the council itself, you'll remember. And so do this sort of self-evaluation conversation. With Marion and Jane, we are working on a survey ahead of the meeting and use the results of that survey as a launching place to have that conversation and perhaps change up our methodology a little bit in the meeting itself, maybe use some small groups, do some other things to really just let people talk to each other about this. one other thing that we want to stress in that self-evaluation conversation is thinking about its applicability to how we're going to be working together in 2022. So in addition to reflecting on how things went, to really push it forward and to say, and therefore, when we're working together this year, this is what we would like to see and how we're doing this. So that's one piece. And then the work plan to do exactly what we just went through now and share that and get the council to provide input on it and finalize. So this is what we're thinking of for the 24th. Let me just pause there, and any feedback or improvements to this. Jared? Wait, you're on mute. Wait.
I'm happy to wait for others if anyone else has something, but my immediate thought is this looks good. I would just suggest adding a fourth, which would be any relevant updates from subcommittees. Like, I think it would be interesting. It would be helpful for the council to know the proposed kind of process and timeline around the development of transportation recommendations and what cross-sector will be doing there and when some of that information will be coming to the council. And if there are others that are ready to provide updates on things that they know will be in their subcommittee kind of work plans or what they're focused on for the next month or two, I think that would be really, or between the council meetings, I think that would be really helpful in terms of us being on the same page, especially since this looks like a relatively shorter agenda compared to some that we've had in the past, just in terms of transparency and us being on the same page. I guess it kind of seems to flow out of that work plan if we're talking kind
Absolutely.
of council as a whole, and then narrowing in on some of the subcommittees and ad hoc groups. I guess the other question I would have about that is, some things we'll be ready to share, some things I'm not clear the way forward, or if those discussions have begun, because they are kind of complex to figure out how they're going to be developed. Like, all of the different subcommittees that have expressed an interest and want to be involved in the biomass conversation. I don't have a sense of how that is likely, if anyone has proposed how that should proceed, but I wonder if things like that should be kind of fleshed out so that there's at least a kind of proposed way forward at that council meeting, or if we just say, Jane, I'm looking to you. I assume you've been at the center of any conversations that would have taken place, or if it's just we need to identify one or more folks who are going to move some of these outstanding items forward in the process and timeline for doing that.
Yeah, I understand and expect, except for the public engagement conversation, that like the other subcommittee, Ag and Eco in particular, won't meet till after the council meeting. So there likely won't be anything to report on for biomass yet.
Okay, great. Chris?
Yeah, I don't know to what extent the Treasury released the final ARPA rules. It's 500-page document, so we're still digesting them. But one of the assumptions had been, previously had been that towns and municipalities would be very limited on what they could spend their funding on, and that it looks like that has been turned totally upside down based on changes to what they call the revenue replacement rule, where basically up to a certain threshold, which most municipalities in Vermont will fall well below, that they can basically just treat the funding they got as revenue replacement, and then that means use that money for anything they want to, which creates a really different dynamic when it comes to like trying to leverage state funds, municipal funds to accomplish like major investment, infrastructure investments and other things. So I don't know if as part of the council we might want to have, because I know that I don't think the ARPA discussions within the council hinge necessarily on any municipal assumptions, but I think the overall context has now changed potentially very dramatically. And I don't know if maybe it'd be worth having Katie Buckley with Vermont League of Cities and Towns explain what the rule as it stands now means for municipalities and what that means strategically for ARPA, use of ARPA funds statewide. But just want to throw that out. What I'm saying here may sound like gibberish, but it's a pretty big deal, because what I suspect that what I was hoping might be able to happen would be kind of a once in a generation infrastructure investment is just going to be totally out the window now, and it's going to go to culverts and dump trucks and temporary raises and other things like that.
Okay. Jared, would you want to react to that?
No, it was a thank you for, if anyone else has a direct response, I had a different.
Yeah, let's just stick with that for 1 second then, Jared, because I want to just test people's appetite. Does that seem like a priority conversation for the Jan 24 council meeting? I'm not quite sure where we take that as a council, right? Because as a council, you already provided guidance on ARPA funding to the administration and to the legislature. Chris, are you suggesting that the council would provide different guidance? Or is this more like an informational thing? Because this almost feels like a webinar kind of informational thing. Unless
I hope to God somebody above me is thinking about strategically what this change means statewide to actually make long-term meaningful investments. Because I think the intent was, I hope the legislature's thinking, about what incentives can we create to encourage municipalities to make these longer term investments as opposed to one-time investments. And that's not the climate act, that's not the climate council's responsibility, but I do think it factors into some of the recommendations that were made. Because frankly, I'm just really concerned that some of the things that where we thought we might see some investment to make some longer run kind of, cross sector, multi-faceted changes probably won't happen now. I'm not trying to light a fire. We still are trying to interpret the rules, but based on the initial read, that's what it looks like. I'm not bemoaning the towns. I mean, if I sit on a select board and I had the choice between going through the challenge of investing in water and sewer so that we could actually have more affordable housing in our town, would I go that route, or would I go the route of buying a new dump truck because we need one? I might, for the sake of ease, go with the dump truck. But anyway, don't want to go too deep, but I just hope, and I don't know, maybe not to put the Secretary of Administration on because this just came out like over the week, like right before the weekend, during the weekend. So
this is what I suggest, Chris,
because I know what the thinking is out there about how to strategically make these investments all work together.
So I'm conscious of the hour, and I know we're going to lose Kristen
I gotta go too
now. Okay, so Kristen, before you jump, is there anything else you'd want to say about this issue or others? Wait, mute. You're on mute. Sorry.
I think after 2 years, I could figure that out, but apparently not. No, I don't. I think the proposed agenda looks good.
Okay.
And I'm not sure. Chris, we're looking at the guidance. Like you said, it's 500 pages, so we're digging in. But I don't have any more to report on that. But the preliminary, we're looking into it.
Okay. So I see a bunch of hands. Thanks, Kristen. Let's just take a few more minutes to do this. I know we typically would do any public comment if folks want to do that. We'll do that in just a sec. On this issue, are these hands, I know Jared's is on something else. Does somebody have a hand on this issue? My instinct is that this doesn't feel like a topic of discussion per se for January 24th, but maybe a flag. And if the council is feeling moved to do something, maybe the council makes a plan to do something about this. And by the 24th, perhaps, Chris, you and others will have greater clarity about what's really in there in the 500 pages. But are any of these hands from Liz or Lauren about this issue? Are they separate issues?
Mine's on the agenda.
Okay. And Lauren?
Agenda.
Okay, so let's take a few more hands on the agenda. So I'll start with you, Jared.
So just quickly, a number of counselors have been asked to testify either in the House or Senate. And I was wondering if, I think one thing that could be helpful is, I don't know as though it needs to be a discussion item, but I think it could be helpful for just information sharing and transparency purposes if the full council had kind of a list of the invited testimony and when it occurred and some links to those, any documents that were presented or shared with the legislature or the recordings. And then if counselors have questions, because I think a key dynamic, right, is we developed the cap, shared it with the legislature, they're digesting it, inviting testimony. And I just think it would be a good thing to create space in the agenda for folks to kind of see how that's being received, what testimony has been invited and given, and have the opportunity to kind of discuss that a little bit.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Liz, go ahead, please.
Yeah, mine was going to be legislative update. So just second what Jared said, I think we should add it to the council meetings through the session.
Awesome. Okay, yeah. And Lauren, I see you put something in the chat.
Yeah, it was
Is it
effectively
kind of the
saying
same?
what Jared mentioned and Liz supported, and then just acknowledgement that I'm not sure we can, we've lost our steering committee quorum with Chris and Secretary Klausner leaving, so.
Right. So we're kind of past the decision-making stage. All right, Jane.
Happy to add the legislative update. I do just want to also appreciate, though, that we only have 3 hours now at these meetings, and the conversation around the survey and work planning. I just, I think that we're happy to provide a legislative update, but we're in 4 committees this week. We're in 4 committees last week. So I expect the legislative update could actually be a very robust conversation. And so we might want to just appreciate and state it as an update and not as a discussion. Otherwise, it could just go on for a long time, I imagine. So, because if we want to have any time left to really dive into some of the other substantive issues. So happy to add it, just appreciate that it's going to be a tight timeline with everything we already have on the agenda.
Possible that instead of, I mean, like you could link the testimony and the opportunities, as Jared said, and then the actual update could be a little bit more strategic, because 2 weeks from now, there'll actually be a little bit, not total clarity, but a little bit more clarity on where they might actually focus some of their time and funding. I know that, committees are looking even this week at some of the funding updates. So that's a suggestion to avoid the laundry list.
Great. Okay. All right. So I'm taking away from the agenda, there's an interest when we talk about the work plan to let the subcommittees lay out a little bit where they stand and where they're doing, so that some may have more to say than others, but we can add that in when we talk about the work plan. There's interest in having some kind of update around this legislative process. And we could also make a reference to the ARPA guidance if there's any more clarity to provide there. If folks have some greater clarity there. Okay, great. How about we do a quick piece of public comment and then we adjourn, because we really have lost our quorum, so we're not really in a decision-making mode right now. Cheryl, I see your hands up. Go ahead, please.
Hi, everyone. So I just have a really fast idea that, everybody was so, overworked up to December 1st and beyond it a little bit. And so the time needs and workload is really unsustainable, as so many people talked about. So one idea is perhaps to increase the size of the groups, some of the subcommittees, with other people who are willing and capable you know, with the expertise of lending a hand to do some of the work going forward. So since there was space in some of the subcommittees in the first place for more people, that I'm sure there are other people that are willing to lend, you know, work with you all.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Just
Thanks for
enough.
that suggestion.
Mhm. Thanks for hearing me.
You bet. Are there other comments for folks who are listening in today? Okay. Great. All right. So we're not in a position right now to talk about Cheryl's suggestion. Let's keep that alive, and perhaps it can be part of the council conversation on the work plan when we have that conversation on the 24th. Anything else, Jane? Is there anything else in terms of clarity of next steps that you would want to say before we finish up? Okay.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Great. Okay, I think we have some clear next steps on all these pieces. Thanks, everybody. It's nice to get back in the swing of things. We'll see you on the 24th, and you'll also see email traffic ahead of then. Jared and Liz, it sounds like you can be helpful in the editing of the report that goes to the legislature. Okay.
Good to see you all. Thank you, everybody.
Take care,
Yeah, have a
everybody.
nice
All the best. Bye-bye.